Hi, and welcome to my class on Ecclesiastes, the wisdom of Ecclesiastes. We know that Ecclesiastes is one of the books of wisdom. We went through Job together, and now we're going through Ecclesiastes. There's also Song of Solomon, which we will likely do after this. But we're going to go through the book with the intent of discovering everything it has to offer us, try to find the structure of it. We're going to outline it very carefully, and we are going to go through every single verse and study this wisdom and apply it to our lives the best way that we can. But before we do that, I want us to go through what we call the overview of Ecclesiastes, and this is giving you the structure and some facts behind the book, synopsis of the book, and also some other details. And so I want us to go right into that so that we can learn together. And the first thing we talk about is the author. Now, the title Ecclesiastes comes from a Greek word meaning a person who calls an assembly. So it makes sense that the author identified himself in Ecclesiastes 1:1 by the Hebrew word, which is koheleth, which translates as preacher, or the one who proclaims. Now, this is a person who calls together a group of people. Obviously, it's a type of leader, in other words, someone who's in a position to teach and instruct and to help. So as we begin to establish who wrote this book of Ecclesiastes, well, it was someone in a position to teach. And there's different ideas out there, but even though he left only this puzzling name, the writer of it, to tell us his true identity, things we see in the book, along with most Jewish and Christian traditions, suggest to us that King Solomon likely authored Ecclesiastes. And you say, well, why would we think King Solomon wrote it? Well, there are different reasons why we believe this. And I've always associated the book of Ecclesiastes with King Solomon, but I recently found out through my more intense study of the book and the background of it from a theological perspective that not everybody believes it was Solomon. And I reviewed those reasons why. We're not going to go into that in great detail. You can always go online and find that information. I want to simply talk about my view of what I believe is Solomon that taught us this. So as we continue here in our outline of this, or our overview, we know that the preacher went on to call himself the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, these are actually in the scriptures. So, one who has increased in wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and one who has collected many proverbs. So, if this is what the writer says, as in Ecclesiastes 1:1, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And we also notice that he says in verse 16, I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. And in 12:9 says, not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. Now, as we consider discovering who indeed wrote Ecclesiastes, we know that it was a fact that Solomon is calling him, or we know Solomon was the son of David, and he was the king in Israel, and it says this, that he is the descendant of David. So we're showing you all the reasons why we would conclude, although he does not come right out and say, I, Solomon, he calls himself the teacher, but it's very important we understand that Solomon was that one that took his father David's place on the throne in Jerusalem as the only Davidic son to rule over all Israel from that city. In verse 12 of chapter 1 it says, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. So this is also where we established that it was indeed Solomon that was this. So, and he was actually said to be in the scriptures the wisest man in the world during his time as king in Israel. And this was stated in 1 Kings chapter 4 verses 29 and 30. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the east, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. So we see here that in 1 Kings, it's very clearly described Solomon is as being the wisest of all people. And so for him to have a book written called Ecclesiastes, it makes perfect sense and is logical. And it also says in other scriptures, it states that he wrote most of the book of Proverbs. So Proverbs 1:1 and 25:1, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, it said. And then in 25:1, these are more Proverbs of Solomon compiled by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. So therefore we can logically identify Solomon as the Gohilith of the opening verse of the book of Ecclesiastes. And this is where we establish the fact that he was Solomon, the author of Ecclesiastes. So you ask the question, who wrote this book of Ecclesiastes? Well, we are going to, for the sake of our study, say that Solomon wrote it and follow that. So the next thing we want to look at is concerning location or setting of where this book took place. So if we see King Solomon as the author of the book, as we already have, we know it had to have been written somewhere before his death in 931 BC. Now, somewhere before his death, but likely toward the end of his life, because it talks this way of the fact that the content of Ecclesiastes speaks as one looking back on a long life of great experience, but not long-lasting rewards. In other words, he saw and spoke in the book, as we will see, as one that's already done it all, been there, has the t-shirt, already finished all the things that could be done. He's ticked every box, and he finds that there is really no great reward for it. He's kind of just speaking, it seems like a cynical approach or kind of despairing, but there's a lot of wisdom behind that point, which we will discover as we go along. But the whole book is an old, experienced teacher looking back over his life. So that brings us right up to the time that he died in 931 BC. So it's probably sometime near that date or before it, of course. And as king, we know Solomon had the position and resources to pursue the fruits of wisdom, pleasure, and work in and of themselves. In other words, everything that come out of wisdom, pleasure, and labor, he had the wherewithal and the time and the patience and the resources to do anything he wanted to learn and study this. And that gives us a lot of insight into these things. But yet the tiresome mood of the writing of this book tells us that late in life, he looked back on his adventures with remorse, directing us to a better, more simple life lived in the light of God's direction. And that's where he writes in Ecclesiastes 12:13, "Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil." So we see this about the book of Solomon in essence of when it was written and how it was written, where it was written. Well, it was written in Israel at the end of Solomon's life, we believe, and it was his last letters of wisdom that he gave us here on earth. And I'm so glad he did, because there's so many things you quote from this book that you probably don't realize come from this book, but as we study it, you will rediscover those things. So I want to talk a little bit now also about the importance of Ecclesiastes. Well, Ecclesiastes gives us a human vision of life that sees things through a very human perspective. However, the book ultimately recognizes the rule, reign, and authority of God in this world. So we're looking at it from man's perspective, what we can do, what we can achieve, what we can accomplish, what we can do with the strength of our own hands, the things that we can think and act upon, but knowing that we are subject to God, and looking at it from a human perspective. If I were to sit with you and talk about life and how things are and what they are, that's how Solomon is talking. He's just giving from his heart what he has found out, as we said earlier, with no limitation of resources, to just try everything. And we're going to read about that. But it is a human view of a man, and that's really good, because this more humanistic view makes the book especially popular among younger audiences today. Men and women who have seen more than their fair share of pain and instability in life, but who still cling to their hope in God. And so that's why it is relative to us today when we read this and understand. Now I want us to consider the objective of the book, and Ecclesiastes shows us a journey from one point to another in a man's life. Solomon declares his starting point early in the book, saying that all is seemingly pointless. In other words, he felt this feeling in his heart that everything was seemingly pointless. And what's the point? I don't understand, so now I'm going to try. And this is in the very second verse of Ecclesiastes 1, verse 2. Meaningless. Meaningless, says the teacher. Utter meaningless. Everything is meaningless, he says. And so this was the initiating point. And the objective of this book is to follow him on this search for satisfaction. This something to make him feel that there's a meaning and a purpose. And so as he's doing this, though, be prepared, because this indicates the complete futility and meaninglessness of life as he saw it. And he writes about it. Nothing made sense to him because he had already tried many remedies to his despair in his search for meaning through pleasure, work, and intelligence, trying to alleviate his sense of feeling lost in the world. And we all go through these feelings that there must be more to it. There has to be more, even as we as believers. Of course, we know that before we get saved, but when we get saved, then we start to feel a little closer to God, or a little better as we're learning things. Well, Solomon goes through this too, but Solomon comes up with a lot of conclusions in his, no matter what his relationship with God was, we always end up having a feeling that there can be more. And it's going to talk about that fact, that no matter how happy a man is, there's something inside of him that seems to cause him to feel that there's something missing. And I don't want you to feel that you're alone when you feel that. And we're going to talk more about that. But we know that he has these perspectives. However, even in his desperate search for meaning and significance in life, God remained there with him through it all. Very important that God is always there. And that's always his conclusion. This is not an anti-God book. It is a very positive reflection. And God is always there with him. For instance, we read that God provides food, drink, and work. Both the sinner and the righteous person live in God's view of and considerations. Ecclesiastes 2:24, where it says a person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. So here we see also that the sinner and the righteous, the good and the bad, the good, the bad, and the ugly, all get to experience the provision of God. And we know this in other passages too. He causes his rain to fall on the just and the unjust. He causes the sun to shine on both of them. We live in a world where God takes care of us all, and so we have to ask some hard questions about why, and what is fair, and what is just. All this comes in the balance of wisdom. This is what we saw in Job. Why? Wanting to ask why. Well, that's exactly what Ecclesiastes is trying to find out, is why. And this is the wisest person. There will never be anyone as smart as Solomon. And so in all of his attempts to discover wisdom and understanding, he is going to tell us from his experience what he feels. But this is some of the things that he's telling us, is that God's deeds are eternal, and God empowers people to enjoy his provision. Ecclesiastes 3:14. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken away from it. God does it so that people will fear him. And this is, of course, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But Ecclesiastes writes all these things, trying to bring us and orient us concerning the greatness of God, when we are having these thoughts, conjectures, and ideas about why and what and where and how can I find meaning and fulfillment. And so ultimately, the great truth of Ecclesiastes lies in the acknowledgement of God's ever-present hand on our lives, even when injustice and uncertainty threaten to overwhelm us. We can trust Him and follow after Him. And that pretty much is the conclusion of what Solomon is trying to say through the book. And I'm preparing you so that, as we go through this, yes, we're going to see some pretty grave ideas and things, but you made it through Job with me. If you did, then Ecclesiastes is going to be a piece of cake. And so let's talk about now the application of the book. Is that we all desire to find real meaning in life, and often that search takes us along twisted roads that are filled with seasons of satisfaction, shining bright for a moment, but eventually fading away. In other words, we live seasonal lives. Some days we are so fulfilled and so happy and feel on top of the world, and the next day it seems like, what's the reason for me even to wake up? What's the purpose? Well, this is normal. And so an appreciation for our common humanity is visible from reading this book. All things that are common to us. We relate to the life and journey of Solomon because it is so much like our own. When we see these words, you're going to find yourself in the book as we go through it and say, yeah, that's exactly what I feel sometimes. And that's why it is wisdom given to us, to know that we're not alone and that people for generations and generations have had these same things in mind. And when we attempt to find meaning in the pursuit of pleasure, work, or through intellectual exploits, we all eventually find it all to be a dead end. And that's exactly what this book says. And I'm surmising it, but it's true. And so Ecclesiastes teaches us about a man who lived through the process of life and came out of it with a wiser, more seasoned perspective of all, which also reminds me a lot of Job. He went through suffering and turmoil. Now, Solomon didn't go through suffering. Solomon went through exactly the opposite of Job. Solomon didn't suffer at all. Solomon's entire life was pleasure to the maximum, that everything he wanted. And if we study Solomon, we know he had unlimited horses and wives and concubines and wealth immeasurable and gold. He was the richest man that ever walked the face of the earth. And even Jesus talks about his splendor and how great it was. He still puts the beauty of the flowers of the field above that, but it was the highest standard Jesus could think of. And so Solomon was so blessed. Whereas, see, in Job, we saw a man so cursed and so bad off and everything going wrong, and he found God in his life. Here we find someone in the exact opposite realm. It's another extreme of understanding and growth. He has everything he wants all the time, and there's no point in his life that he does not have it. He observes all the things in life from a perspective of absolute wealth and wisdom, but yet still sees everything as worthless, grasping at the wind. And this should teach us something. No matter how bad, no matter how good things are in life, there's only one thing we truly need to understand, and is that God is with us. And there's going to be issues and problems in life, sure, when we're surrounded by the temptation to proclaim life's ultimate emptiness. We can find in Ecclesiastes a vision tempered by experience and ultimately seen through divinely colored lenses. In other words, God is the one that brings Solomon to these conclusions. Very important. Life is destined to remain unsatisfying if we do not recognize God's intervention. Very important. And when you live without God, that's why so many people are in so much despair, and they have no belonging to anything because they do not know God, and they're wandering around and they end up miserable. But if we know Christ, we will always have Him as our base. This life, everything that Job lived, everything that Solomon lived, everything that all men have lived throughout time, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, on down all the biblical individuals, Noah, everything they've lived has all ended up leaving them in a state of dissatisfaction, error, problems, issues, sins, everything. And all they all needed was God. And that's what life is destined to teach us. And so Ecclesiastes is going to entertain the details of these facts to help us gain our wisdom from it. So, have you struggled with the meaning and purpose of your life? Have you found yourself seeking a deeper reason to live each day but cannot seem to grasp it? Well, this is what I want to say. You're not alone. And that's one of the benefits of this book. It'll let you know that no matter what you have, you may always have these feelings. So we need to listen very carefully to the words of Solomon, that they might encourage us to place our trust only in the Lord. And so this is what we're going to do. We're going to follow an outline, and I've prepared an outline structure for you. We'll just kind of glance over it first before we begin. Outline of Ecclesiastes, we divide it thusly. Introduction and theme will be the first 3 verses of the first chapter. Then we're going into the first catalog of vanities. And we're reading from the NIV. The vanity is really from the King James and other versions. So it's going to be a type of a worthlessness that we see where he says meaningless, which is the same as vanity in this case. But we're going to see these meaningless factors or these vanities in the catalog of vanities under the first one, which we the vanity of the natural world. We're going to see the vanity of wisdom and knowledge, the vanity of pleasures, possessions, and accomplishments. And all this will bring us up into chapter 2, and we'll see more of the vanity of wisdom, and then the vanity of labor. And all that bringing us from the first catalog of vanities to what is called a poem. A time for everything. We all know this scripture very well. There's a time to live, a time to die, etc., etc. And we're going to break that down and look at each of them and discuss it as we talk about a time for everything. Then we'll go into part 5 of our outline, which would be Fear God, the Sovereign One, chapter 3, verses 9 and onward. And then it brings us to the 16th verse of the 3rd chapter, where we'll see the second catalog of vanities, the vanity of mortal life. We're going to see more of the vanity of labor, and then more of the vanity of wisdom. And then finally we get to the fact that we need to fear God, the holy and righteous one, and that's chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. Then we're going to see life under the sun and all the things that men go through. Chapter 5, verse 8, all the way to chapter 7, verse 24, where we see injustice, greed versus contentment, wisdom for living under the sun. And then our 8th section we'll go to will be the heart of the problem, sin itself, as discussed in chapter 7, verses 25 through 29. Then finally, number 9, more on life under the sun. We're going to see wisdom in dealing with foolish authorities, the importance of fearing God, the limits of human knowledge, the unpredictability of life and certainty of death. We're going to talk about finding enjoyment as circumstances allow, more on the unpredictability of life, and the paths of wisdom and foolishness. And under that category, the power of wisdom and proverbs concerning wisdom and foolishness. And then finally, wise practices in the light of the unpredictability of life. Then we're going to talk about aging and the vanity of mortal life. And finally, number 10, we're going to end with the final conclusion and epilogue in chapter 12, verses 8 through 14. So that's where we will go and how we will study. So I'm excited to bring this to you, and we're going to go right into it from the beginning and as we discover in our outline of Ecclesiastes here in our introduction and theme. Before we do that, though, I want us to pray together for God's direction in this endeavor. Father, as we study together the book of Ecclesiastes, I'm asking you for insight. I'm asking you for wisdom. That's what this book is all about. It's about wisdom. You said, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and does not rebuke him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. Because a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. He's like a wave in the sea, driven with the wind and tossed around. And that person cannot expect to receive anything from God. We're not like that. We're asking, Lord, truly for wisdom. We know this world is vain. We know the things of this life are meaningless. But I want to discover the words of Solomon. I want to discover the words of Ecclesiastes to help bring balance in our life. The kind of balance we learned from Job. The kind of balance that we learn from life itself. Life is a teacher, and there are so many things about it we don't understand. And we think if we were just smarter, we could. But Solomon is the smartest man that ever lived. And so he, in writing to us these words, can help us. So Lord, help us to understand it. I pray that you would open our eyes and our hearts and our minds. It's your word. Your word is precious. Holy Spirit, speak through this. Holy Spirit, teach us. Speak between the lines to every participant in this class. In Jesus' name, we ask for your blessing on this. Amen. Amen. So we go back to our outline now, and we begin with introduction and theme. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verses 1 through 3. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. They are establishing, of course, that he is king in Jerusalem, and he is the son of King David. And he calls himself a teacher. And we know that people came to see Solomon from far away. The Queen of Sheba came and was amazed and said that how blessed the servants of him were, that they could stand and hear that wisdom. So he began speaking. He's meaningless. Meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? What's the meaning of all this, he wants to know. That is the very introduction and the theme of this entire letter. Vanity of vanities. Everything is meaningless. And so now he goes into the catalog of vanities, and this is going to span from chapter 1, verse 4, all the way to chapter 2, verse 26, the first section of it. So we start with the vanity of the natural world in Ecclesiastes, now 1, 4 through 11, where we read, as it says, generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets, and then it hurries back to where it rises. In other words, it goes around the other side of the planet and then comes back up again. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. That's what the wind does. If you look at the global picture of the earth, you'll see that the wind are these patterns, and there's air streams that flow, but it comes and goes and comes and goes. There is no new pattern out there. Weather has always been the same. Even if people would say, well, there's climate change now. No, it's been, and Solomon's going to talk about that in a little while, but the wind is blowing. It says all streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. How can it be? How is it that the water keeps pouring into the lakes, keeps coming from the rivers and the tributaries and filling up the lakes and the oceans? But if we fill the pot in our house or a bucket, eventually it's going to overflow. But all of this water flows into the sea. All streams flow there, yet the sea is never full. Why? Because to the place the streams come from, there they return again. How is that? Now this is fascinating, and it shows you a lot about the wisdom of Solomon, because this was spoken or written in a time when people did not have this scientific theory of water and how it processes in the circle of weather. They didn't understand meteorological things. They didn't understand the principles of evaporation, condensation, and sublimation. They didn't know that water could evaporate and rise into the skies and then travel in clouds and rain down upon the mountains, or accumulate as snow on the mountains until the seasons cause it to melt and come back. But here it's saying very clearly that these streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. Just as they were up there, wherever these streams are coming from, this water, instead of filling up and overflowing from the oceans, it just keeps going back up there. This was understanding the process of evaporation and and condensation, precipitation, all those things. He says all things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. You see, the comparison that Solomon is making here is that just as that water is in this never-ending cycle, so are all things that we experience on earth, that the eye sees. It's never going to be full. Your eye is kind of like that ocean or that body of water. The streams of water are coming into it, the things you see, but yet it's never full. No matter how many TV shows or how many movies, no matter how many books you read, no matter what, you just continue. They just keep going in and going in and going in. They don't overflow. They keep going in, and that knowledge and all these things that we learn and see just makes this cycle. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again, and there's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which you can say, look, this is something new? It was here already long ago, Solomon says. It's been already. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. So what Solomon is saying, that no matter what we think we have amassed in knowledge and understanding, because of the cycles of the earth, just like the cycles of water that continuously turn, things that have been are gone. I remember not long back watching a really interesting study about things as the decay of things on earth, and how objects made of different materials, how long they last. Even things made of solid stone, if left in the weather long enough, will disappear because the weather can erode them. And most steel, for instance, will, in 1,000 years, is gone. And unless it is protected very carefully and preserved, it will rust into powder. It'll just decay into nothing. And so structures that were built long ago, we don't know. I like to really think about the fact that no one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them, meaning that there has to have been many civilizations on earth. We honestly don't know what was taking place on planet Earth during the time of all the way back to the flood, and we certainly don't know what was taking place on the earth before the flood. So during that time before the flood, when men was living hundreds and hundreds of years upon the earth, even to 1,000 years, they had civilizations. It says that the earth was filled with people, and they multiplied and multiplied, and they built structures, they built houses. And this is where I always talk about archaeological finds, and even subterranean, or without actually pulling things out. They do a lot of surveying and sonographic viewing of the inside of the earth, and they have found remains of massive complexes. We find suddenly these, like Angkor Wat, in the middle of jungles. We find massive metropolis and these big full spaces with all of these things out there, which are astounding. And we did not know they existed, but it was only thousands of years ago. There's no historical record of these things. And it's really amazing when you consider that things come and things go. But we see something today and we think, wow, this is great. We see it in the little things, right? Like clothing styles or hairstyles. Right now I see hairstyles coming back that I have not seen since the late 70s and early 80s. I see clothing styles. I, in my lifetime, have seen blue jeans become bell bottoms and become straight legs and then become bell bottoms again, and now go back to tapered legs and straight. It keeps on cycling through. There's nothing new. There's nothing new. Music styles right now are revisiting the old disco patterns and all the old R&B patterns, and it just keeps on going in a circle. And we would think that our music today is nothing like it used to be. We would think, oh, what about this computer technology we have today? You don't know that computers did not exist a long time ago. And you might think, well, that's ridiculous. But how would we know? What evidence would there be that they did or didn't? We know that there was calculating devices. We know that within the Chinese Empire they have found machines that they cannot describe to this day and how they function. There are waterworks in ancient Rome that man can still not understand, yet are functioning and are still functioning to this day. So that's the emptiness of us. We think we're so smart and we think we know so much. But later nobody's going to remember the former generations. And the things yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. This is where he's starting. This is just the very beginning, the vanity or the worthlessness of the natural world as we see it around us. But he goes on, as we're looking at the next part, he's continuing in Ecclesiastes, and this is now from verse 12. Let's go back to our outline, because we'll see this is now going to be the vanity of wisdom and knowledge. And so he says here in the scripture, I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. In other words, the deeds of men, what men do. What's really fascinating to me, because I love to watch what people do, people in their expertise. But they all have to work. Everybody has to work. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind, Solomon says. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, look, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Sometimes he suggests then, what if we didn't know as much? I have found this to be true, that it is absolutely, I know we all want to be educated, and we try and work toward educating and making sure people have a good education. But if you consider it all said and done, I've met some of the happiest people in my life in the villages of India. I've met some of the most joyous people of my life that have no concerns and are happy and smiling all the time to the age of 100 plus, and they have no education. They cannot even read or write. So Solomon is saying here he applied himself to understanding wisdom, even madness and folly. This means studying the thoughts and the ways of man, studying people who have become insane or who do not have a proper mind. This could be the study of psychology. This is social studies of the way people interact. He's looking into this, and he is finding that it all just doesn't make sense. It's a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and the more knowledge, the more grief, he says here. Fascinating as he's looking at the vanity of wisdom and knowledge. Now he goes on, as we're continuing on into the second chapter, we see the vanity of pleasures, possessions, and accomplishments. So here, in the second chapter of Ecclesiastes, it starts in verse 1. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. See, this is one of the first things that he's looking at here is about pleasure, having a good time. He decided, I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry, or in this case, I'm going to test myself with fun and laughter and enjoyment. And there's nothing wrong with these things, but ultimately it is still vanity and emptiness, he concluded. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. While we're here on earth living, what do we do to entertain ourselves? What do we do to fulfill ourselves? laughter, enjoyment of life. And I tried cheering myself with wine. This means that he did these things by consuming the wine and getting intoxicated, laughing with his friends. And we've all done that at times and only realized later that if we're not truly founded on a relationship with God, all of those things just kind of make you end up feeling hollow. And that's why he refers to them as madness and emptiness and vanity or meaningless things. So that's part of this pursuit of pleasures. In verse 4, he says, I undertook great projects. This means he did these endeavors. Sometimes we think if we do things with our hands and make things, it'll make us feel good. And we all have hobbies. We all make things. I build Legos. My wife cooks meals and makes cookies and cakes, etc., etc. And these are projects that we do. Why? Because we want to feel good. We don't always do these things because they are needful for survival. On the contrary, we do them so that we can enjoy life. And that's what he's talking about. Great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. In other words, he worked very hard by these projects that he did in industry, these great projects, building these houses, these vineyards. Of course, these vineyards also were productive, and he made money with them. We know also Solomon imported horses, and as well as slaves that were bought and sold in and through him. Those horses that he took in from the Middle East, he then sold those horses to the nations. So he was a horse dealer, and he bred also those animals, and he did all these things, all of them amassing him more and more wealth. And he owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before him, meaning all the patriarchs combined didn't have the quantity of wealth that he had in animals. And he amassed the silver and the gold by the sale of those animals, and also acquiring it through mines. So that's where in his time gold becomes so common that everything was made of gold, all the utensils in the homes, and silver was like a rubbish metal next to that. Silver was used for rubbish bins and trash cans, and he had gold everywhere. All of that. All the things sometimes we think we want. We always want these things from Lazada and from Amazon, and we see these pictures, and they're in our feed, our timeline in Facebook, and we want to order that and order this, and we see this at the shopping mall, and they present this and that. And imagine if you had no limits and you could have it all. Well, that's what Solomon had. Anything he wanted. These projects he did made him so rich. And this industry he created, even the production of these plants, animals, all things. He had all the women he wanted. As he says, the delights of a man's heart. It's a delight of a man's heart, of course, to have a woman. But Solomon did not stop at one. He had many. He had many concubines, many wives, no limit. You could not possibly keep up with activities to keep all of those women interrelated with you. So therefore, there was no limit, as he calls it, harems. Do whatever he wanted. The delights of a man's heart. He said he became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before him. And all this my wisdom stayed with me, meaning that he didn't lose his mind. He had wisdom that was teaching him, what do I get from this? And so he denied himself nothing. Whatever he saw, he could take. He refused his heart no pleasure. Whatever thing that seemed right, he just did it. Very few people have been able to test the limits of our humanity like Solomon was, and his heart took delight in all of his labor. He's so excited about the work of his hands, and this was the reward for all of his toil. Everything he did, it was more about just the delight of the fact that he did it. That when I when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Nothing. And so here he did all of these things, these hard works and these endeavors to study, to learn, and to develop animals and industry and all this money. And it was all vanity. Vanity of the natural, vanity of wisdom and knowledge, vanity of pleasures, possessions, and accomplishments. And he did very well. And when he did, he ended up feeling like it was all for nothing. It just didn't make sense to him. Vanity, emptiness, worthlessness, grasping the wind, trying to hold on to something that's not there. He tried cheering himself with wine, drinking, doing all these things, tested all of these ways. And so he became an explorer of the limits of humanity. As a human being, he took it upon himself to do what none of us can really do. There are very few people. There are some Jeff Bezos types out there. There are some Bill Gates out there that have so much money right now, they practically can do anything they want. But none of them could come close to the power and the wealth that Solomon had. So in this, Solomon used those resources to do whatever. He tested for us so that it'd be like if I want you to go and see a place for me and come back and tell me about it. I'm going to use you as my guinea pig, as they say. You go try a certain restaurant. You come and tell me about it. Well, Solomon did that for us all by having the power to go and try everything and do everything and be more successful than anyone, and let you know how that worked out for him. And even as we're reading just in the beginning of this, that's what he's saying. It's just all nothing. Worthless. What does it really give you in the end of it all? Now, he's not going to leave you there. And it's where he says this, that yet he surveyed all that his hands did. After he really took tally of all these great works that he did, he decided that everything was meaningless. What was the real point? It was a chasing after the wind. And there's reasons why he's saying they're meaningless and that they're chasing after the wind. And the rest of the stories, or the book of Ecclesiastes, as we go through it, he's going to give you the details of why it's such an empty endeavor. And then later, of course, help us to find what we do need to know. He said that nothing was gained under the sun. You'd say, what do you mean nothing was gained, Solomon? You had all these possessions. But see, what he's talking about is the peace of mind and the rest of heart. Where do we find that? True meaning. What does it matter if a man gain the whole world and forfeit his own soul, Jesus said. There's a spiritual balance that we need to find. This life, all is meaningless, and it will continue. We're going to continue this. We're going to take a break right here, and I'll see you very soon in our next session here in the wisdom of Ecclesiastes.